Hello visual novel fans, today we've got a review of Paradigm Paradox. This review was written by the lovely Katie Pajamas. Please go follow her on Twitter with the links in the description. These are her words, not mine. Let's see what she thinks of this. Well, there's another Otome. 2022 has been a year of fantastic Otome releases. Just to name a few, we've had Variable Barricade to start off strong, Even If Tempest, that did pretty well, the Amnesia game saw a re-release with newly localized content, and the second Pure Fury came out recently, all of which you can find our reviews on VM Paradise, hahaha. So, with Paradigm Paradox coming out, I was hoping we would see another continuation in the saga of amazing Otomes for this year. Paradigm Paradox, developed by Automate and published by Axis Games, promises a story of science fiction set 500 years in the future, with much of the world, outside of several colonies, being deserted and toxic for human life. It was first released for the Switch in Japan in 2021 and is now seeing its Western release 1 year, 5 months later this week. This Otome features not a small handful of love interests, but 8 different choices, 6 of which are immediately available and 2 of which require a little extra work to unlock. The game also features one last grand finale, as it's called, that only unlocks after all routes have been completed. In addition to this, there's also extra lore and background story bits that you can look at through the activity report section in the extras menu. These don't add a lot, but give you a little bit more time with the characters, as well as add details that may not be discussed during the game. Paradigm Paradox took me around 33 hours to 100% complete, which is shorter than you'd expect for an Otome with as many routes as this one. Each route, however, lasts only around 3 to 4 hours a piece. Our story starts with us meeting our protagonist, Yuki Takanashi, a regular student in the colony of Theta, one of the locations that was protected and walled off from the uninhabitable lands that plagued the world. While she is an orphan and only has her uncle and her best friend Lise to communicate with, she lives an easy, charmed life, surviving without a care in the world in the school dorms, until Yuki one night leaves her room close to curfew and runs into Vectors, the monsters that plague the colony at night and attack humans on sight. As a Vector attacks and injures her, she is rescued by the 4-member magical girl superhero team, the Blooms, who come to her aid and simultaneously make her a new member. In doing so, she faces off against not only the Vectors, but the 3 humans leading them, who impose their own superpowers against the Blooms and aim to attack the humans of the colony. What Yuki doesn't realize though is that the girls on her team aren't what they seem, and are actually 4 familiar male students that assume a female form to utilize their superpowers. And they might not be the only ones. What follows is 9 different routes, both with the villains and heroes, where you get to have the story unfold route by route and learn how the world works and the true intentions of every character. Paradigm Paradox has no lack of characters to meet and routes to experience. You start in the common route of the game, and depending on your choices throughout, are sent to either the villain or justice route. From there, you proceed with whichever love interest your choices dictate, breaking it up into 8 routes with our love interest divided between the Blooms and the villains. For the villain side, we get to meet Hyuga, Yukinami, and Ibuki. They are the leaders of the Vectors and live amongst them in a separate colony from Theta. I love that the villains are given their own routes and a chance to explain their side of the world. That doesn't happen often, and it gives more life to the game, conflict, and characters. For the Bloom's Justice route, you'll meet Kamui, Ayumu, Mihaya, Ryo, and Tokyo. Kamui is the carefree ladies man, Ayumu is the strict, rude student council president, Mihaya is our quiet, judgmental bookworm, Ryo is the assistant to the Blooms and incredibly mysterious, and Tokyo is the handsome, sleepy genius. Kamui, Ryo, and Mihaya's route were very mid-range, but Tokyo's route definitely is the most redeeming out of all of them. Ayumu had the second worst Otome route I have ever played, as he was not only very unpleasant throughout 95% of it, but just in general had a very repelling personality that I can't ever find believable that anyone would love. I was ready to be done with him as quickly as possible, so thank goodness for short routes. When it comes to our villains, we have Hyuga, who is basically the maid of the villains and the grouchiest of them all. Yukinami, the weird, obsessive, crazy one, and Ibuki, who has the best route in the entire game, both in terms of writing and story development. Most of the routes felt below par and weren't necessarily a drag to get through, but didn't feel as engaging as they could have been due to their length and storytelling. Because there was so many characters, it didn't give the breathing room for the best of them to shine, which I think would have helped the game out in the long run. The last route available in the game is the grand finale, which has its own route that lasts around 1 to 2 hours and has 2 endings, both generic, good and bad. Each individual route features a couple of bad ends, a normal end, and then a happy end. There's also several bad and normal endings scattered throughout the common, villain and justice routes. The recommended route order for the game is Kamui, Mihaya, Ayumu, Tokyo, Hyuga, Yukinami, Ibuki, Ryo, and then the final route. Both the music and art don't really stand out in any large way. The CGs were a bit of a letdown as they didn't feel like there were a lot of life to them, and they didn't convey any noteworthy or special scenes. Several of them even looked very similar across routes and could easily be compared to each other. The art wasn't low quality as the whole game had a very crisp feel to it, color and style wise, albeit a little generic. The same applies to the music. It's very good background sound to apply to the scenes, but I did find it occasionally it didn't fit the setting which it was featured in, and again it wasn't bad, just generic. Unfortunately, this was an example of an Otome that while it had a couple of things I appreciated, there was far more I wasn't in love with. To focus on the positive first, there were very few translations and text errors, which is a huge plus considering some recently localized examples have suffered from that on launch. While there are a couple of line breaks that felt awkward, it doesn't take you out of the story at all, just interrupts the flow slightly. Additionally, I loved the way the game was presented. It's very easy to navigate and has a lot of polish in both its UI and the flowchart that's used to select and revisit parts of the story. This made backtracking for different endings very easy, as well as helped me figure out where I was missing CGs and how much longer the route I was on was gonna last. One thing to mention concerning the flowchart is I did have several crashing issues when attempting to open it mid-route. Not sure if this will be addressed in a day 1 patch, but it is something to note if you plan on opening it and haven't saved in a while. Moving on to the negative aspects of the game, the story itself feels initially engaging as you first get to know the characters and are introduced to their backstories and learn more about the world. However, once the common route and villain justice routes are surpassed, that's where things become less interesting. As mentioned earlier, each route is around 3 to 4 hours long, and that being the case, you're given little room for any type of romance or real bonding between MC Yuki and her love interests. There were a couple of routes where it seemed there wasn't even romance at all, only hints of Yuki internally monologuing about how her blush was an indication of how she felt, but the other party not really putting forth any signals. I don't expect there to be any extreme romance in every Otome, but even some of the shorter and less well-known Otomes had more to them. My favourite route, Ibuki, led me down a path of high hopes and then dashed them with how little actual romance there was when he was by far the most appealing villain route. Furthermore, because of the route length, it leaves the characters feeling underdeveloped and underused. Yes, every character has the typical conflict and resolution to their said conflict throughout the route, but since Yuki and the characters spend so little time together throughout, it just feels lacking. This was especially apparent in the villain routes outside of Ibuki. Yukinami and Hyuga suffered greatly from short route syndrome, as they are given little romance and MC interaction despite being interesting additions to the story. A big gripe I have is how disappointingly the gender swapping male to female mechanic that some of the characters are given was utilized. It felt so forced in the game and wasn't given nearly as much attention as I would have liked it to be, as it was never more deeply explored or discussed other than surface level conversation. One character even states they don't need to swap to their female form, but that they only do it because they just find it makes them feel more powerful, and isn't even actually necessary since they hold the same power either way, thus making the fact that they do it entirely useless. It didn't feel like it was a main story element and was criminally underutilized. If you're going to give these characters such an interesting trait, explore it. Tell us more about how it makes them feel. How could it affect the story? Especially if you're going to put it in the description of the game as a plot hook. Lastly, I just want to touch briefly on Yuki. When reading an Otome, one of my biggest pet peeves is when it features a protagonist that doesn't make you want to get behind the story or characters. Yuki, regrettably, falls into this category. While she's not unlikable, she doesn't have much in the way of a personality. She has her moments where she stands out and stands up for herself, but she feels so much like a fly on the wall instead of part of the conversations she's in. I wish she would have felt more like a character as opposed to just filling a void for the protagonist that every Otome needs. Overall, Paradigm Paradox is a game that fits the phrase wasted potential. In what started as a promising premise with exciting looking characters, gender swapping romance choices, and a rich backstory filled with science fiction elements, unfortunately lands in a category of mediocre Otome with a ton of ideas that weren't executed as well as they could have been. It's not an Otome that stands up to the more hotly anticipated ones that we've had this year. But that doesn't mean it should fall completely to the wayside. I wouldn't say jump into it if you're looking for a hot and heavy romance or deep entertaining roots. Go in expecting a few cute stories, a couple of good roots, and a small selection of gorgeous CGs. I also can't recommend this to anyone that wants to start getting into the Otome genre, as it's not the best example of what the genre can provide. If you're looking for one to play that has some quick bite-sized roots with several confusing and abrupt endings that make you feel as if nothing has been resolved and the best parts of the story have been skipped over, then boy do I have the game for you. It's this one. A 5 out of 10. That's a little bit disappointing, but thank you to Katie Pajamas for writing this review. She knows what she's talking about when it comes to Otome. Will you be picking this one up? If you do, if you still want it, then consider checking the links below in the description to purchase it physically and support VN Paradise at the same time. Thank you ever so much. Please go watch some of Katie's other reviews. She's done a lot of them so far and she's a great writer. Take care.